1991, she turned oral history about New York's Crown Heights riots into the award-winning Fires in the Mirror. The next year, she got strangers in Los Angeles to open their tender skin and let her climb into the LA riots for Twilight, Los Angeles. Welcome to Women in Theater. I'm Linda Weiner, theater critic of Newsday, and our guest is Anna Deavere Smith, who interviews people. We'll interview her. Now, have you created a genre? I mean, what have you done? Now, every play I see practically is a testimony play. Do you laugh at that?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I can't be the one to say I created this or I created that.
Let me do it. She created it.
Okay. Okay. So you know, I was doing that in response to my time, the time that I lived in, which was the late 80s. People weren't that interested in particular in talking about race relations, which is something that's real interesting to me, and I knew that I had to kind of make it, sort of put a tough topic in a jewel box. And so that's what I was trying to do. And the only tool I had at the time for that was that I was a mimic. And so I decided...
Since childhood?
Since childhood. So sort of take that ability to attract attention and make people laugh sometimes, and to use it to make people laugh and make them cry and make them think about something. And sort of inside of that spectacle or that acting, that mimicry, or something like it, they came somewhere. So that was responding to the time. I would suppose that now, if it's true that a lot of people have kind of occupied that space, which I deliberately put outside of the context of what theater was thought to be, maybe I should find another thing to do. I don't know. What
you could always play Stella.
Yeah, I could play,
it's time to play Stella.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, just now, in this past season, you know, David Hare is doing sort of docudrama, testimony drama about, it's called Stuff Happens, about the start of the Iraqi War. And then there's one person shows about Iraqi women based on interviews. Then there was the one on gays in the military. There's Guantanamo testimony. So in some ways, I think that what you did, still doing?
I'm still doing it. Absolutely.
I think that what you did and are still doing is supplying, making up for the deficits of journalism.
Well, I would say it's making up, to get in trouble, it was making up for the deficits of theater. I mean, art should make up for the deficits of journalism, just like journalism should make up for the deficits of civic discourse among politicians and institutions. To me, journalists, that's your job, right, is to some extent, you know, like, look at the gaps and speak truth to power. Well, my book, Talk to Me, raises some questions about the extent to which journalism has done that, at least political journalism, after Watergate, or how much, you know, political journalists have been chasing those big prizes in the big houses that you know, Woodward and Bernstein got from do what they did well. And so I really came to the reality because the theater was stuck in what I thought was behind the times, particularly with regard to race, right? And so that's what I was doing, is I was trying to find reality and saying, man, reality is more varied than anything I'm seeing on the stage. I was trying to enliven the stage. So if you feel that that had an effect and that other people are doing that, then I'm very pleased, because that's what I was trying to do. I thought I was doing it to teach actors how to be more animated and more like people.
And that was at Carnegie Mellon?
Carnegie Mellon, it was at USC, and a little bit at Yale, taught there briefly. But now, you know, what concerns me is that so many institutions have lost the public trust. And I think that in the last 6 years, the interest that artists have to speak and reflect on real life, in some ways, taking the role that we thought that journalism had, is very exciting to me. And in the late 90s, I spent a lot of time creating the Institute on the Arts and Civic Dialogue, which ran at Harvard.
It was at Harvard.
It ran at Harvard, but it was started at the Ford Foundation in the hallways there, just like a lot of very important theater movements. So I created it, and we sort of shopped it around. There were a variety of universities, and Harvard picked it up. And at that institute, a lot of wonderful artists, grown-up artists, gathered together each summer and created works about social change. And the appetite for political art is exponentially more now than then. And so I think that these people who are doing docudramas are asking the theater and other art forms to grow too, so that we can also be a part of speaking truth to power in a bit of a more upside down way than journalists tend to do.
Your project from the beginning, or your little title that you walked around with, I don't know if you still do, was On the Road.
The Search for American Character.
The Search for American Character.
Right.
And long before Fires in the Mirror, which is when we all found out who you were, about the Crown Heights uprising. I used riots twice in the introduction,
Right.
but I was smiling inside because I remember when you were working on Twilight Los Angeles, and you would talk to people about what do they really call it, because
Right.
everyone was calling it riots.
Well, this brings up, as you know, Linda, one of my favorite stories, which was that I was very self-conscious about being in L.A.
This is 1992.
This is 1992.
Right
Everything
after Rodney
was
King.
right after Rodney King, right after the verdict. The riots had happened, and I came to L.A. In August. The riots had been in April. And the city was so divided that even African-American artists, sort of went to the press asking why I was the one coming to L.A. to write a play. I wasn't from there. Well, that's not true. I had sort of suffered at USC at the time in a different stage in its history. It's grown a lot since then. But I was at USC in South Central at a time when guards would chase black boys off the campus, in this peculiar, white power bastion of, rich, wealthy white kids. And I taught there, but right there in South Central. So I had been a part of it. But nonetheless, we had that. We had, So one of the things was that you could be judged immediately depending on how you seem to be. So I was worried about, could I speak well to the Latino community? Didn't speak Spanish. How would I speak to the Korean American community? Didn't speak Korean. Wasn't Korean. How would wealthy whites feel from Beverly Hills when I sat with them? Would they think I judged them? How would the people in Simi Valley feel? How would the cops feel? How would the DA feel? How would it be like to talk to Angela King? I assumed that nobody would trust me because I would be something not enough. And so I would test who I was talking to, because I wouldn't say, what'd you think about the riots or the uprising? Because right there, it puts you in the wrong camp. If you called it a riot, well, the progressives would say it was an uprising, or even a revolution, right? So, and I kind of even felt like I wasn't black enough, I wasn't down enough. And I know that you remember when we went to sit with this one activist, Queen Mocha, who actually became quite a champion of my work. Here we were sitting there, you, me, and the young woman who was driving me around, who was from South Central, Keisha.
And very dark.
And well, I would say very African-American looking. She had braids and so forth.
She was darker than I was.
Oh, she was darker than you, she was darker than me. And here we are sitting there at this table,
Yes.
me anticipating being blown out of the room by Queen Malka, who was, in African garb and so forth. And at one point in the interview, she said to the three of us, as we sit here today as black people. And so, she suddenly made you black, right? She certainly endowed me with what I already had. She wasn't having a problem. I guess I had said, what do you call this? She definitely thought it was an uprising or a revolution. And actually, in going around LA, one of the most rewarding things was finding those points where people were willing to take me in as one of them. Mm-hmm. Even if I wasn't, like with Mrs. Young Sun Han, sort of the probably one of the biggest, most rich interviews that I got of a Korean American woman who reflects on justice after her store had been burned to the ground.
What's been the reaction? Do you ever go back and talk to the people who've been in your shows to see what kind of effect your art has had on their lives?
Well, I have
Might be negative.
Well, sure, I guess, but I would say that I've stayed in contact in each play with somebody. You know, in Fires in the Mirror, I actually became quite great friends with Robert Sherman, who had a selection called Lousy Language in that play. In Twilight, I actually got to know Twilight Bay very well. Took a long time for that to happen. The person who the play was named after, he didn't even come to see it. And years later, when I made a film of it, he didn't see that. And but he called me out of the blue and said he wanted to write a book about his life, wanted me to help him. One of the most moving things in my life. And I flew him to New York, and he saw it. In one of my recent projects, I did a piece for the Museum of Modern Art and also a piece for the opening of Zankel Theater in Carnegie Hall, and I interviewed a cowboy for that. And he's been to New York to see the work. I see him when I can. He's the lead in an article I wrote about the Republican Convention. And so that, you know, I kind of develop relationships would be the word with people and try to keep reflecting on who they are and who I am. And I suppose by doing so, they bring me closer to their America, and it's not just a one-shot deal of a one-hour interview.
What you were referring to when I accompanied you for almost a week in '92, and I drove around with you and sat and watched your interviews, which was a absolute privilege, and absolutely something that as a critic I would never do. I just decided it was worth it. You know, all bets are off. But I do know at that time you told me something that always stuck in my mind about what you're looking for, how you really get these people to open up. And you said that there are 4 questions that will always get people to change their syntax, which is when you see that they're actually out of their language, so you've got to them. And one of them was, have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do?
Right.
And another one is, did they tell you about your birth? And a third one was,
have you ever come close to death?
Close to death? Or do you remember the first day in school?
Exactly.
And did you find that people always respond to one of those in a way that...
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I was first learning to do what I did, I write about this in my book, Talk to Me, at Random House, published a couple of years ago, a linguist told me that years ago when I described what I was trying to do, which is to get people to do something that occurs in Shakespeare, which is that they're going along at a certain rhythm, and that at what point do they kind of break that out open and change that. For example, in the debates right now, you know, we're in the presidential campaign of 2004. So Bush and Kerry tend to speak about the same things over and over again. Iraq, they talk a little bit about abortion. They talk a little bit about, a lot about taxes. And so where do you find them break out of that? And Bush broke out of it in the third debate when he was asked by Bob Schieffer about how the women in his life, and he talked about meeting Laura Bush in the backyard, that love story, and then he goes on to say that she speaks English better than he does. And so you suddenly see this whole thing melt. So I'm always looking for that. Now, and so those questions taught me how to listen. I never ask those questions anymore. However, I do try to find one question that will cause people to talk in a very long monologue without me having to ask anything. So, for example, when I had the chance to interview President Clinton alone in the Oval Office, which was quite, I mean, you have no idea how hard we had to work to get that. I was told I had 10 minutes, so I knew that it had to be full. And I asked him one question. And it's derived from, have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do? This was in '97, before the Monica Lewinsky story broke. And I said, Mr. President, do you think you're being treated like a common criminal? Oh, well, he was off and running. I was in there for 35 minutes with people knocking on the door. Mr. President, you have to stop now. And finally, somebody walked in and said, okay, I'm shutting this down. He has to rest his voice. That's it. When I got back to my rehearsal, I got a call from his office, you know. What did he say, right? Because we were off and running. Or I did a piece at the Yale School of Medicine about the relationship between doctors and patients, and very moving after having been in Washington, interviewed 500 people. where, you know, I read their books, I did everything. Nobody told me anything. Because, of course, the history of Washington probably starts, you know, Thomas Jefferson could never be found, as they say, in verbal undress. So they dress themselves in their words in Washington. Yale Medical School, I sit across from patients, turn the tape recorder on, one question. What happened to you? That's it.
Yeah.
Told me everything.
I would think that most people would assume that you use a videotape in order to remember these characters whom you then become in your one-person shows. And I was startled to find out you just use a tape recorder, and then at the very end you take a photograph, and you told me that's really more for the art designer, for the, you know, the set designer in costumes, than it was for you. But that you really deal with the voice, right?
Well, I changed now because of technology.
Okay.
I didn't want like big camera crews walking in. You know, it really was remarkable, Linda, that that I agreed to have you accompany me, and frankly, it's because of your face. I mean, it's and you were born with that. So, it's that you have a very sympathetic face. Probably if you had a different kind of face, I would have said no, because I allowed people from the staffs of the different theaters that I've worked in sometimes to come in interviews, and they move and shift and grimace and things and show their opinions. Well, it can't happen. So here's Keisha with her braces, grinning from ear to ear, and then you with this kind of lovely angelic face. It was fine. I'm not just lifting. That's the truth. That's the truth. So I don't like to have people there because they may do things or act bored, which are going to affect the interview. But now that technology gives us these little DV cameras, I take those in. And the other thing is that before, it was this relationship between me and my headphones and a little tiny Walkman, a very intimate relationship. I didn't feel that way sitting in front of a television. But now that those DV cameras are these little things, I sit, you know, it's no bigger than a book to hold my camera and look at the image. So it's something about really intimacy that was going on. And now that technology provides me with that, I use the image.
You studied linguistics.
I didn't. I wanted to be a linguist.
Oh, okay.
But
what were you doing at Beaver College?
I was
the all-girls college.
Oh, God. Well, you know, God bless it. Actually, when I look back on it, it was a pretty terrific experience. But I wanted to be a linguist, and I studied languages. But I got afraid of the mathematics, or what looked like mathematics and linguistics, and I ended up not doing that. But at the time, I was studying French, German, and Spanish with the idea of becoming a linguist.
And then went to San Francisco. We're doing a little bio now, quickly. Went to San Francisco.
Looking for the revolution.
American Conservatory Theater, did some acting, got a master's degree, and then
came to New York.
Did your on-the-road stuff.
Yeah, came to New York very early, got a wonderful teaching job at Carnegie Mellon University, but wonderful as it was, didn't like university life, came back to New York, walked dogs, and did temp work. And while I was walking a dog called BB, and a little Doberman, miniature Doberman, and doing temp work around the city, I developed this project.
Okay, now you are working at NYU exclusively, or?
Well, I'm working and, you know, I'm writing, I'm
yeah,
acting
I know,
when
but
I
you're
can.
actually...
I'm a professor
You're
at
based
NYU.
at NYU. You were
Yeah.
at Stanford, you were at Harvard, you were at... Yeah,
Well,
now
my
you're in-
institute was at Harvard.
Okay.
I was never at Harvard
All
during
right.
the year.
So, do you have a home?
New York.
You have a home?
Tribeca.
Do you have a family?
No, I mean, well, I have my unfortunately, I lost my mother last year. I have my family, and I have friends, but I don't have children. I didn't
a
get
puppy?
married. I have a dog, actually,
All right.
who teaches me a lot, Memphis, who's pretty fantastic. She teaches me about instinct.
Yeah, everything I learned from animals. It's
Mm-hmm.
true. And your father was a professor, owned a coffee and tea in
My
Baltimore.
grandfather owned a coffee and tea business, which he started with a 6th grade education.
Do you think he'd be surprised about Starbucks?
I think he would be very upset and sad because
Yeah.
this was a guy with a 6th grade education who started his business with a push cart and imported coffees and teas from around the world and spices. His shop was a very magical place on the all-black business street in Baltimore, Pennsylvania Avenue, jazz club up the street and so forth, great big market. And it was just this magical place with things coming from all over the world. And he sold, you know, in a segregated environment to black businesses. And, you know, at that time it was sort of Maxwell House. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school in San Francisco that these kind of coffee shops started popping up. And I'm thinking about Grandpa's store. And my father worked for him. And my grandfather's been a great inspiration for me. He was very verbal. He had business acumen. And I was crazy about him.
And your father's name was Deavere Smith?
My father's name was Deavere. My grandfather's name was Deavere. Deavere Smith, Deavere Smith, Deavere Smith. And now we have Deavere Smith the Fourth.
And so your name is, would you say your name, please?
Deavere, Anna Deavere Smith.
Deavere, yes.
So it's a feminized version of Deavere.
Okay,
yeah,
that's all.
Deavere was a family name,
I
my
see.
paternal great-grandmother.
Thank you very much. And the one thing I know about your childhood, besides you being oldest of 5 children, is that you've once said that you were very, 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 very afraid of getting into trouble.
Yes.
Now, this
Still
is a
am.
little girl I cannot imagine.
Yeah.
Look what's sitting across from me.
I'm still afraid of getting into trouble. I don't think I'm troublesome. I think people think I am because I ask questions. Period. Everything starts with the question. And so, you know, that troubles people. But I think I'm less trouble than a lot of people I know who nobody thinks they're troublesome.
The thing about your pieces, the 2 big ones that everyone who loves theater knows, is that by interviewing all of these people, there's a kind of Rashomon thing that happens. So that I've never walked out of one of your pieces thinking, I know exactly what she wants me to think. You know, because you really are giving us a lot of different people's ideas.
Why would you want me to tell you
No,
what
I
to
don't
think?
want you
Right.
to. That's sort of what the problem is in some of the plays that have come after, is that, you know, I knew everything about gays in the military before I came there, and yes, it's really a problem, and when I left, I thought, yes, it really is a problem. I know a few more specifics, but it didn't open up what other people were thinking.
Well, look, one of the most rewarding interviews I've had in a long time, I did a piece this fall at NYU, really because last year 4 kids committed suicide, and that was a bit much, to put it mildly, and I immediately wrote to the president and said, after the 3rd death, and said, look, you know, what can I do? And he suggested I do a performance, which I did to kind of kick off the new year, more like a sort of welcome. And one of the people I interviewed was an economist who's on the short list for the Nobel Prize, extraordinary man called Tom Sargent. And in his interview, he talks about a profound ignorance, right? And his whole work as an economist is to answer the question, you know, like Greenspan has to have an idea of the way the world works. He has a theory about it. And that theory, it tells him what to do, right? Well, what if the theory's wrong, this economist asked me. So says, or what if you can't get the best theory? Says, what do you do? So it's decision-making in the face of a profound ignorance. That's what he's working on. And he says, you know, look, you know, a great example of that is, you know, what people thought in the 80s was going on between the Soviet Union and the U.S. and Afghanistan. Totally, after September 11th, we realized how much we didn't know. And so I think as an educator, you know, I love teaching. I'm on my way to class now. As an artist, what I should be doing is trying to increase my audience and my students' capacity to deal with the idea of the reality that we face a profound ignorance, that we have a profound not knowing. And so what are we going to do about that, rather than to promise answers? And I've never promised answers in the classroom or on the stage, and I've been teaching at least since 1973.
Well, before I got here, someone asked me to have her give me an answer about West Wing. Are you still in West Wing?
I am, as of now. I'm
Yes.
in episode 4 this year.
National Security Advisor?
Yes.
Yes.
And guess what?
What?
I'm actually the first black national security advisor. Let me tell you this quick. I hope we don't run out of time. I taught at Stanford, as I've mentioned. Condoleezza Rice was my provost. And so I'd had meetings with her across the table like this. And so when I got the call to come be on the West Wing, I arrived in Burbank, and I said this was in July of 2000. So Bush was running for president at the time, there was a little bit of chatter that perhaps Condoleezza Rice was going to be National Security Advisor. So I said to Aaron Sorkin, I said, are you thinking about Condoleezza Rice in terms of like asking me to do this role? And he said, who? So my joke is that I'm actually the first black woman National Security Advisor.
And you created Testimony Theater. And we have very little time left, and I'm in mourning here, but I know that in Fires of the Mirror, you mentioned the man who said we have lousy language.
Right.
And he meant about race, that we have
Right.
lousy language talking about race.
Right.
What about the lousy language about talking about war now? It's Orwellian, no?
Well, I just think
Now you
that
have to answer in 30
in
seconds.
30 seconds, I think the politicians are afraid of giving the wrong answer. And they certainly are not going to say to the public that leadership is about dealing with the great unknown. So I would say that given the fact that language is so covered and so limited, now is the time like no other time for artists to come forward with an expanded language.
Anna Deavere Smith is perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. On behalf of the League of Professional Theater Women, I'm Linda Weiner, and this has been Women in Theater.